Hey everyone, Pastor Tim here, and we are continuing on in our study of the book of James and continuing to talk about the topic of how we actually study the Bible. So we're in the home stretch here. We only have a few more weeks as we dig into the book of James. I hope you've enjoyed this series. So with that said, let's delve back into those 5 areas that help us think about how to study the Bible, and then we'll jump into the book of James. So we've been talking about this process of studying Scripture and how to do that, and there are 5 steps to do so. We start out by looking at where is this book or this passage within the storyline of the Bible. When we figure that out, we next ask for some background on the book. Who's the author? Who are the recipients? What's the purpose of the book? And we delve into that a little bit. And then we work through these 3 steps of observe, interpret, and apply. We observe the text without making any conclusions. Start off just by figuring out who the key characters in the passage, what are the key actions, what are the key concepts being put forward. Then we interpret, okay, in light of that, now what do we understand the text to mean, particularly to the people who it was originally written to? And then application, as we say, what was the truth that was established 2,000 years ago in this text, and how do we apply it to our lives today? So we'll continue through that process as I observe and interpret, and then in your small group time, you'll have a chance to work on application. So we're going to be in James chapter 5, and we're going to be starting down in verse 7 and going down to verse 13. So let me read this out loud. We read this: "Be patient then, brothers, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, and how patient he is for the autumn and spring rains. You too be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Don't grumble against each other, brothers, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door. Brothers, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we consider blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. Above all, my brothers, do not swear, not by heaven or by earth or by anything else. Let your yes be yes and your no, no, or you will be condemned." So big theme here is obviously patience. James talks about some other things, but clearly the big idea is about patience and waiting on God. And then again, we observe some of the ways he talks about it. He talks about it by talking about farmers and how they have to wait for their crops to grow. He talks about waiting for the different seasons. He talks about the prophets who had patience in the face of suffering. He talks about Job, who had patience in the face of suffering. So the theme is patience. The theme is waiting. And it's not just waiting, though. It's waiting with anticipation of what's to come, and it's often waiting through suffering. Not W-A-D-I-N-G, but waiting through suffering, right? We have to wait oftentimes for goodness to come out of something that we're going through. And many of us know that we've gone through hard seasons, that you come to the other side and you're like, I don't know exactly what God is doing in this yet. And so it's a continual call to wait and to persevere, because one day God will make everything right. And James even talks about that, we observe, when he talks about the idea that the Lord is coming. He's going to return sometime quite soon. So James' theme here is patience through suffering, and also waiting on God, his return, and also on God to do what he's going to do. Now, we also note here that he talks about the idea of judging one another, and he says, don't do that. So James sees this idea of patience and suffering, and somehow he ties it in to judging one another. We're going to have to figure that out. At the end of this section, he talks about not swearing by anything, heaven or earth or anything else. He says, let your yes be yes and your no be no. That's a question of integrity, right? What you say is true. I can trust you. You don't have to say, I swear I'll do it, or I promise I'll do it. Just do it because you said yes, or don't do it because you said no. So there are some of the big things that we can pull out of this text as we start to observe the key ideas. Let's jump into it now and do some interpretation. "Be patient then, brothers, until the Lord's coming," he says in verse 7. "See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, and how patient he is for the autumn and spring." So the idea of patience, James ties into the idea of be patient until the Lord's coming. James is giving us a glimpse here that not everything, when it comes to our suffering, our struggles, and what we have to wait for in life in general, not everything is going to be resolved. It's not going to all be taken care of. Sometimes Christians can live with this idea that if I'm a Christian and I do the right things, quote unquote, then God will give me deliverance in this life. He doesn't always promise that in this life, because James starts out by says, be patient until the Lord's coming. We have to wait sometimes for the return of God, for him to make it all right. Notice here that James uses the analogy of a farmer, and he says the farmer waits patiently for the land to yield its valuable crop, and he's patient for the autumn and the spring rains. So he says, you too, be patient. And then he says, stand firm because the Lord's coming is near. Twice in that opening section, James reminds his readers that Jesus is coming back. We talked about a few weeks ago the idea that when James says in the last days, anything post the resurrection and the ascension of Jesus is really the last days. Now we can talk about the last days, but we're talking about the last days, anything after the resurrection and the ascension of Jesus. And so James is reminding us, Jesus will be coming back before you even know it. And so be patient and wait. That sometimes is an idea that we don't like, honestly, because we want Jesus to fix it now, or we want Jesus to come back this second and make it all right? Fix it from while you're in heaven, Jesus, or come back and sort it all out right now. And yet James is saying, wait, be patient. That's hard for us to do, I think, if we're honest. And that's something we can delve into in the small group time. He continues on and he says, don't grumble against each other, brothers, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door. Again, judge standing at the door is this idea of Jesus is near, so be careful. And he warns us about our behavior. Don't grumble against each other. One of those themes that keeps popping up in James is favoritism and tension amongst the brothers and the sisters who are in the faith family, right? So he says, don't grumble against one another and be cautious because the one who will judge the grumbling, he's not far away. He's standing at the door. Continuing on again, brothers, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As we know, we consider blessed are those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance, and you've seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. Job went through great suffering, and God brought redemption at the end. Many of the prophets didn't get to see the redemption. They didn't get to see all things turn around and be made right. Even if some of the prophets did get to see that, Israel often went sideways and messed up again. So let us remember that we're called to persevere in suffering. And what we're banking on is not that God's going to make it perfect tomorrow, but that God will make it all right in the end. How do we know that? It says the Lord is full of compassion and mercy. We have to live and wait in patience as we suffer through the challenges of this life, James reminds us here. He says, above all, my brothers, do not swear, not by heaven or by earth or by anything else. Let your yes be yes and your no be no, or you will be condemned. Again, the end of this section, and then earlier up in verse 8, James reminds us about condemnation and judgment. James doesn't pull any punches throughout the book, but even here, he's reminding us, hey, you got to be careful because there is one who is a righteous judge, and we are not to mess with him, right? He gives us a clear picture at the end when he says, don't swear by heaven or earth. Let your yes be yes, your no be no. Be a person of integrity. Be a person who is trustworthy. And in the context of this passage, think about when you're going through suffering, sometimes it's easy to make promises, or it's easy to get so overwhelmed by things that you could start saying things that aren't actually true. So James reminds us here, don't get caught up in the midst of the suffering so that you start saying things that aren't true. Be true to your word, even in the midst of patient suffering and waiting for God to either redeem or God to return. Now, big picture here as we close out. See here that James is not, again, appealing to God will make it all right in the next few days. We can hope and pray and want that and anticipate that even in some ways. But also we have to remember that God doesn't promise to make it all perfect overnight. In the deepest way, this passage is a call for us to long for eternity. If you know the book of Revelation at all, in the end of Revelation, we don't see the idea that we're going to go floating off to heaven, but that heaven and earth are going to become one. It's going to be Eden 2.0. The world will be perfected. So one of the questions we have to think about is, do we anticipate that? Do we just kind of live this life thinking, okay, I hope God makes it easy and simple, and yeah, one day I'll get to heaven? Or do we anticipate, do we long for the return of Christ so that all will be made right? This is a little bit interesting to me because I had a conversation with somebody today about the idea of the end times, the idea of God returning in his triumphant way and making all things correct. So interesting that I'm digging into this topic and listening to some teaching on the topic, and now James is reminding us, persevere. Don't quit, even in the midst of suffering, because one day Jesus will return, and he is a God who's filled with compassion and mercy. Now, as you head into small groups, we're going to have some time to think about and talk about the topics from this text. And I want, at a heart and soul level, I want to challenge you and encourage you to really dig in and ask the question, do I anticipate the return of Jesus? Do I anticipate Jesus making everything right? Do I long for that? And do I bank my life on that? Because that's James pressing us to a deeper level than just saying, yeah, it'll all be fine. He's saying, no, live for and anticipate the return of Jesus. All right, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week. Take care.